So, Philip, we're in a very interesting time right now with the vaccinations, and people are thinking about going back to the office. I think it's a good time to kind of look back. What has happened over the last 14, 15 months? If you look back at Julius Baer over the last 15 months, what have you learned? What are the key insights that you have gained?
Not sure if it's a good time to look already back. I think for that we still have a bit of forward momentum. It's, even though you're right, I think it's probably the last mile in the tunnel, even though they always feel like the longest.
That's true.
What have we learned? We've learned a lot of things. We've learned how resilient we are as a company. We've learned how flexible our people are and how well they can manage in different situations. We've learned how good actually our IT, our technology is, which was a bit of a surprise. Right. I think no one thought that we could go into a lockdown and remote mode just within a few weeks at the beginning of last year, and it was possible. Yeah. We learned that our clients were following the new mode in a completely straightforward and open way. We learned that we can do great business, that we can do a lot of transformation. We learned how to use WebEx. I think okay. We learned a lot of things.
Now, say a little bit more about the people flexibility. Can you give a little bit more of the examples on what especially stood out?
I think when you're running an organization, obviously you're relying on your org chart, on the regular meetings, on the proximity, on the floor design that should bring certain functions together. And this is how things have been running for many years. And you almost couldn't imagine that differently. And then you throw people into a completely different environment, into a completely different setup. And you find out that actually the organization starts to self-organize and does that almost within a logical second. I've been amazed by the quality of our team heads, of our group heads, of our entire management cascade, where people have embraced this new setup just like that. And they've been making the best out of it. They've maintained full operational readiness with maybe a few hours in between the working from home and the sorting out the technicalities. But Julius Baer had not been interrupted during those weeks. And from a management approach that was built on proximity to a management approach that was built on something else, this has been a completely seamless experience. And everyone from top management down to all our employees have just embraced the situation. This was amazing.
What made that possible?
I think it starts with the DNA. I like to think. Obviously you need the technicalities and the process and the support and everything, but it starts with the DNA. And I think what has made it easier for us was that Julius Baer always had a DNA where people, individuals, take responsibility, where people do not just fill their little boxes and try to do their job, walking in at 8 and walking out at 5, but actually where job profiles are much larger, are much deeper, are much more complex and interwoven, and so where people are used to managing dependency, but also like that. And obviously that was an important prerequisite to manage a very dynamic situation. Then I think it's also a company where people still know each other. This also made it easier because there was this implicit element of trust that was just woven through the organization. And yes, even though we didn't see each other, we knew who was on the other side of the line and so could continue to operate. By the way, that's even more important right now after 15 months when I have not been able to travel to our Asian operations during that entire time. But still, this is working at a very high effectiveness and efficiency. And so I think we had a few prerequisites in place that made this transition easier. Other companies have gotten there too, but I think this was in Julius Baer's DNA.
I think that investments companies have made in the culture before the pandemic are paying off big time in how people act during the pandemic, right?
Have you seen any company where it was almost impossible to get into pandemic mode, or have they all made it somehow?
I think it's more they all make it somehow, but some with more falling and getting up than others. And I think the culture and the trust is the difference. I really like your comment about self-organizing. Because my guess is you knew very little of what to actually do when this hit you, right? So if it all had been dependent on a hierarchical frame, and I think those are the companies that struggled, because then you're just sitting back and waiting for the top to say, okay, Philip, go do this. Right? I think those are the companies that struggle. The more hierarchical you are, I think the harder it is to react to a crisis. And I like this concept you said, self-organizing. I guess you don't mean do whatever the hell you like, huh?
No, not quite.
Right. So what keeps the self-organizing then also business-focused, Julius Baer focused at the same time?
I think having a clear objective, having a clear view on how the business works is a very important piece. I always tend to say this with a smile. Yes, we have a complex business, but Julius Baer also has a simple business. Why? We are focused on serving high net worth and ultra high net worth private clients. And yes, of course, there is a ton of combinations and permutations on the solution side, on the geographies, on the interactions, but I still think that our business is a business that can be understood by our employees, and not just, again, in their own little boxes and in their own product areas, but people tend to understand also the interfaces and where their work connects to. And I think it was that understanding that enabled people to continue operating in a very smooth way moving forward. Maybe turning a bit of a disadvantage into an advantage. Had you asked me 3 years ago, where does Julius Baer have potential to evolve? One of the areas I would always have mentioned is we could professionalize or industrialize some of our processes, where sometimes we improvise, sometimes we reinvent the wheel. In normal times, obviously this is a hindrance. In times like this, it is a strength because people know how to improvise. And we'll have to find a balance moving forward.
In terms of moving forward, right, I think what allowed them to have those interfaces, you said it yourself, is the proximity that existed before. So how do you keep this self-organizing part alive as there's, maybe not right now, but increasingly a return to proximity? Is there a chance we fall back into old habits?
I think that's always the biggest danger, isn't it? I think human beings always gravitate back to old habits. That's the natural course of things. And so our role right now as leaders is to bring in the right amount of energy and disruption so that they can't do that. And setting parameters in a way that it's just not possible to go gravitate back to the old normal. And one way of doing it obviously is by telling to all our people across the organization, managers or not, that we want to give them a degree of flexibility moving forward, and which will absolutely prevent any manager from having all of their people back in the office. They would raise their hand and complain. So with that started, obviously, then we need to work very hard in finding the right way, in finding the right new normal. And frankly, I don't have the answers to that yet. I think it's going to be a process. It is going to be a journey on which the organization will discover what to make of the new freedoms, what to embrace and what to not embrace, maybe even to further develop the tools that we have now started to discover. I wouldn't say that after 15 months, we're, for example, proficient in really using hybrid digital physical interaction.
Sure.
We're just scratching at the surface. And having just an iPad somewhere on a desk with an expert waving, that's not integrating the two worlds yet. So there's a lot of journey still to be done. But I think we as a company need to create a space to experiment with that and to get better.